Welcome, everyone, to the Intel Network Builders webinar program. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for our presentation titled Iricent AppNose, Software-Defined LAN Using Open Daylight. Before we get started, I want to point out some of the features of the BrightTalk tool that may improve your experience. There is a questions tab below your viewer. I encourage our live audience to please ask questions at any time. Our presenters will hold answering them until the end of the presentation. Below your viewing screen, you will also find an Attachments tab with additional documentation and reference materials, including a number of websites and documents mentioned in this presentation. Finally, at the end of the presentation, please take the time to provide feedback using the Ratings tab. We value your thoughts and will use the information to improve our future webinars. Intel Network Builders webinar series takes place live every week, so check the channel to see what is upcoming and access our growing library of recorded content. In addition to the resources you see here, we also offer a comprehensive NFV and SDN training program through Intel Network Builders University. You can find this program at networkbuilders.intel.com/university. Today, we are pleased to welcome Damian Murray, co-founder and sales director, and Rory McHale, CTO, both with Iricent. Damian has 20-plus years experience in telecommunications and IT networking with major industry players, including Siemens and Nokia. Damian has held a succession of senior business development and sales roles in the ICT sector. Rory has 30-plus years international experience in the telecommunications industry, working with Igensold, Amiens, Logica, Altiscon, Saftec Telecom, and Siemens AG in Munich. Rory has previous startup experience and held the post of CTO in his last two engagements. Welcome, Damian and Rory, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
So thanks, Renee, and welcome everybody. Welcome to our AppNose Software-Defined LAN webinar. Just before we start, I just want to run through quickly the topics that we want to try to cover today in the context of outlining, I suppose, why we developed AppNose and what we believe the applicability of AppNose is in a service provider and an enterprise context, but also with regard to the underlying technology aspects, which hopefully you'll find interesting. But before we get going with that, we want to walk through just a little bit of background, I suppose, explain a little bit about what Iricent is, why we set up the company, and just give a little bit of history, a little bit of context, I suppose, in that respect as well. We'll talk a little bit about the software-defined networking space, or the software networking space, and I suppose give some perspective that we've developed over the course of the past number of years in that regard as well. Primarily, obviously, the focus of today is to introduce AppNose, our SDN application. We want to walk through the features and the benefits, obviously, of those features to our customer base and onwards, I suppose, to their customer base as well, but also talk a little bit about the deployment model in that context. Rory will talk through the architecture, explain some of the component parts, and we'll outline, I suppose, the integration with the Open Daylight platform and what the benefits of that are as well. And then, I suppose, before we wrap up, our plan is to just give an outline of kind of some of the things that we're thinking about and some of the actions that we're planning to take over the course of 2017 as well. And just give a little bit of an insight or a window, I suppose, into the future with respect to AppNose and with respect to some of the functionality in some of the markets that we plan and hope to address in that respect. So just to put a little bit of context on things and just to give, as I say, a little bit of background, Iricent has been around since 2014, so we're just about 2.5 years old at this point in time as an organization. Some of our own background, obviously, is quite comprehensive, and we've been around for quite a while in terms of the telecoms industry, both on the vendor and the operator side as well. So we've got a pretty comprehensive background from the point of view of having an understanding right across the industry. But our focus, I suppose, primarily is on the technology areas of software-defined networking and network function virtualization. So very much the focus of Iricent as an organization is on both of those two umbrella technologies, I guess you could say. There's clearly a strong overlap between them, but we're very focused on that space and on the benefits that those technologies bring, both from the point of view of the telco or the service provider, but also from the perspective of the end user. in that context as well. Predominantly, our products are cloud hosted in the form of applications and functionality, which we deliver onwards as a service to our customers. And we've built that up based on a range of capability, I suppose, around development, in-house development, deployment, and integration capability that we have, and that we've leveraged in order to both develop Apnos as a platform, but also to develop some of our other capabilities and offerings. And I'll talk a little bit about them, I suppose, in context as we go through this today. But I suppose we've been selected as a high potential startup by Enterprise Ireland, which is a development agency here locally since August of last year, and that's a useful forum, I suppose, for us as a relatively small company in a very large industry, in terms of helping us to scale up to meet the requirements that customers have. And importantly, I suppose, in that same context, we work within a comprehensive ecosystem of partners. I suppose ecosystem in many respects is a very overused term in the telecoms industry generally. Everybody has an ecosystem, but it's very important, obviously, in the context of, no one player can perform all of the functionality or deliver all of the functionality that the customer requires. So there's a lot of cooperation, increasingly so, I think, in the software networking space, more so than we would have seen before. And an important component part of that ecosystem really are the affiliations that we have. The affiliation with Intel as part of the Network Builders program, obviously in terms of facilitating today. We also participate in the SDNFE standards group. It's an interesting area for us in the context of some of the work that we do, primarily on the NFE space. I suppose lastly, in that same context, we're a member of the open source Nano community, which is an interesting activity in the context of a lot of the developments that are taking place around NFE, particularly in the management and orchestration space. So just moving on to explain a little bit about our kind of philosophy, I suppose, in some respects, in terms of what we do. So I've already mentioned that the focus that we have is primarily on software-defined networking and network function virtualization. We combine that, or we couple that with a software as a service delivery model, and that's really to try to ease the adoption and to facilitate the adoption of the functionality that some of our technology brings. We deliver that to service providers who are predominantly our target customer audience, and our aim is to enable them to rapidly deploy both flexible and application-aware cloud-based services or cloud-based applications to enterprise customers. So again, it's the facilitation of the adoption of SDN and NFV, which I think is one of the hurdles that the industry has been trying to get over the past number of years. And our aim is to try to take some of the barriers away, I guess, in that respect, to facilitate that. So, just a couple of words on our approach. I mentioned previously that we've got a specific focus both in NFV and SDN, and today we're going to focus primarily really on the SDN side of what we do, looking at software-defined networking, looking at the implementation models that have been around, looking at some of the benefits, I suppose, of SDN, and adding, I suppose, an element to that as well. And in that sense, I suppose, traditionally SDN, in our view, really has focused on the ability to manage and, by extension, then to automate network functionality as well. A lot of the focus was taking some of the complexity out of networking as it exists. We all know that SDN was born mostly in a data center and has moved beyond that since then. But a lot of the early term focus really has been on taking costs, taking complexity out of networking, and then ultimately taking some of the longer term costs through OpEx reduction away by introducing agility and introducing network automation. And they're all extremely worthwhile targets, I suppose, in the context of the technology adoption, and very, very beneficial from the point of view of the end users, whether that be the service provider or anybody else for that matter. But there is another dimension to this, and it's effectively a top-down view, which we believe is an important characteristic as well of the benefit of leveraging the benefit of SDN in that space. And it's really, if you take this into, or you take into account the user or the application or service that's being delivered, and if you take a view from that perspective, what that does is it facilitates you to view the network as effectively just another virtual resource, And clearly there's always going to be a physical component of that, but when you centralize the control and management of that, it allows you to do things that you couldn't have done previously when you're talking about specific dedicated devices perhaps. When you centralize control, centralize management, the capability to leverage that obviously and to drive a revenue stream associated with that perhaps is an interesting one. And we set out to explore that a couple of years ago, and that's ultimately, I suppose, what led us to today and to the introduction of Apnos, which was formally launched last October to the marketplace as well. And I think when we talk about the Apnos capabilities, you'll start to see some of the ideas, I suppose, in that respect coming to bear, because really what we're talking about is leveraging SDN as a revenue opportunity, as distinct from just a cost reduction opportunity, which hopefully, facilitates a number of activities and a number of engagements from telcos with respect to their end customers, as well as talking about taking out some of the complexity and some of the more detailed functionality that would have been in place from a networking in a more general sense also. So let me introduce Apnos on that basis, and I suppose really just to take a simple view, as I mentioned, Rory will talk through some of the more specific functionality in a couple of minutes' time and talk about some of the underlying technical aspects, I suppose, of the platform itself. But Apnos is primarily a cloud-hosted and multi-tenanted application that we deliver to service providers who in turn deliver some of that functionality onwards to their enterprise customers today. It focuses on network access control, security and optimization for enterprise customers. And really what that means is the ability to manipulate and control traffic, prioritize traffic in the enterprise environment without having the complexity of the sort of the more traditional network engineering skill sets that would have been required to implement that functionality. And so to be able to do that on a centralized basis. Primarily the functionality that we offer is the ability to prioritize and control traffic either by application type, by device, by user, or in an IoT context obviously by thing, or by time of day, or some combination of all of the above. And what we're aiming to do, as I said, is to drive simplicity, I suppose, in terms of the prioritization of that. And so clearly what's important obviously as well is that we deliver a lot of that functionality via what we believe is an intuitive user interface. And our aim really is to ensure that enterprises can take advantage of this type of functionality, can implement that, can make changes effectively in real time without having to have the in-house network capability, the in-house resource, or without having to have the cost of the external resource or external capability to be brought in and to make those changes as well. What's very important, obviously, as we move onwards then as well, is that we've implemented a powerful reporting analytics module. So we gather up an awful lot of the information, we gather up an awful lot of the detail around the activity, I suppose, that's on the network, both in terms of some of the traffic that's there, type of users and so on and so forth as well. And we continuously monitor that and analyze and obviously present that back in terms of reports either to the enterprise or to the service provider on a very customizable basis, to allow enterprises and to allow the service provider, I suppose, to take advantage of that information and perhaps implement more specific policies based upon the type of traffic. And we're constantly expanding that functionality as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we move on through the slides. Today we are focused exclusively on Open Daylight in the context of Apnos. It's built specifically for Open Daylight, and we focus on OpenFlow. But again, I'll talk about some of our plans with respect to expanding some of that functionality as we move on as well. And ultimately, what we aim to deliver is a platform-independent application. And by platform independent, I mean really an application that's independent of the underlying infrastructure. So there's one or two criteria, I suppose, that we need to meet in order for Apnos to be able to control traffic. But beyond that, this is not a vendor-specific or function-specific application necessarily in the context of the enterprise community who are targeted as the end users for this. So just to give a little example, I suppose, of the type of functionality maybe that we implement, and I'll talk about this in the context of a relatively small enterprise, perhaps it's, let's say, an accountant's office where there might be 35 users in place today. Use a range of IT functionality some of which is perhaps cloud-based, others maybe is maybe on-site. But they don't necessarily have an in-house resource. They don't necessarily have an in-house capability. So every time they want to make a change, every time they want to implement something new, they've got to call somebody from perhaps their local IT integrator company or something like that who need to, schedule some time, and a few days later they maybe arrive, make the change, implement that change, do it on a one-off basis, and obviously there's costs associated with that, and that cost might come in at a couple of €100, a couple of $100, depending obviously upon the geography. So what we're talking about and what Apnos delivers really is the ability for the end customer, without any technical capability, using what is a very intuitive user interface to make changes, to implement changes, to implement policies around the usage of the network as well. And a good example of that is where you've got the managing partner perhaps in that accountancy company, who's makes very important calls. Obviously, maybe uses Skype for Business. Needs to be in constant contact with customers and needs to make sure that traffic isn't interfered with in any way, shape, or form. We've also, you might have somebody who's responsible perhaps for marketing for a company, who takes advantage of the company's Facebook page, maybe, or some of the social network or social media profiles for the company. So you want to make sure that person has access on a universal basis. But you may perhaps want to limit access to things like Facebook, for instance, for other users, possibly during working hours. And then maybe a third engagement or a third component would be that you might have some people in the office who you just want to make sure they can't be sitting watching Netflix or YouTube or something like that all day long. So it's very easy to implement policies, very intuitive, obviously, for the administrator on behalf of that enterprise to implement these policies based upon the type of user. So managing partner, obviously, his Skype for Business traffic gets prioritized on a regular basis. Marketing person is allowed universal access, for example, to Facebook, while everybody else is perhaps denied Facebook access during working hours, but perhaps has it outside of working hours. And then you might want a universal block or a universal low priority policy associated with things like Netflix or some other entertainment-based resources that perhaps you don't want people to be taking advantage of during the day. Similarly, obviously, you can implement those policies. They can run on an ongoing basis, or they can be updated in real time. So if there's something specific happening on a Tuesday afternoon, for example, the company can make a change specific to that Tuesday afternoon based upon whatever the criteria are for that as well. So just to talk about, I suppose, a little bit more detail maybe around that in terms of what the drivers are, and specifically titled this slide, Apnos designed for the enterprise, on the basis that, our target end audience for this is enterprise customers, obviously. And that can be a range of different types or a range of different characteristics of customers as well, but they're typically people who have, a reasonably comprehensive IT requirements, be it a small enterprise or a medium to larger enterprise as well. And one of the key characteristics that we see coming out of that group, I suppose, is the fact that a lot of workload, a lot of functionality is moving to the cloud. That can be simple, simple Office 365 type implementations, right through to maybe specific applications that the customer uses on a production basis or for manufacturing or something else like that as well. And obviously, the customer, the enterprise in this case, needs to ensure that they've got access to that functionality, but doesn't necessarily want the complexity and some of the cost, as I said previously, of maintaining the on-site networking capability or any on-site networking capability for that matter. The enterprise themselves want to retain some flexibility, they want to retain some control. But again, those smaller enterprises perhaps don't have that capability in-house, and they don't want to necessarily have the larger cost of outsourcing that. For larger enterprises, the criteria are probably slightly different. It's typically a complexity and cost argument, but perhaps coming from a different perspective, in the sense that they want to maybe take out some of the cost that already exists in that respect, and possibly remove complexity, especially where that's a diverse enterprise, maybe over multiple branch offices, for example, or a number of different locations, where it's just not possible or perhaps not cost effective to have an IT resource maybe, or a network resource, let's say, in each of those locations. So that the requirement to have something that's flexible and a little bit more intuitive in terms of its usability is important in that respect as well. Obviously, security is an everyday focus. It's a concern for all of us, I think, today. Both as a result of the proliferation of devices, the type of applications, the access methods that we use, and so on and so forth. And again, there's a requirement to simplify some of that security-based functionality as more and more complexity, I suppose, gets introduced in the context of the user. We want to ensure that obviously the underlying technology is simplified to some extent, obviously, to allow for a little bit more flexibility and agility in that respect. And then, really what's really important, I suppose, in that respect is that we understand that what's happening today isn't necessarily what's going to happen tomorrow. So we need some sort of feedback mechanism. We need some sort of reporting mechanism to allow us to get visibility of the network activity and to implement or change the existing policies or implement new policies based upon some of that as well. Apnos delivers all of that functionality today through the intuitive interface, obviously, in terms of being able to help us to remove some of the reliance away from skilled resources. It's a centralized approach. It's automated, so it's not complex necessarily in the sense that traditionally individual changes on networks would have been in terms of looking at some of the legacy technology that's there today. It's very easy to configure various different functions and various different policies around, whether it be access control, security, barring, whitelist, blacklist. It could be any range of functionality, and as I mentioned previously, that can be on the basis of any set of criteria that you choose around all of the various different inputs, I suppose, with respect to networking. We've implemented, or rather in the process of implementing, active learning and discovery mode as well, because it's our belief that in the context of this needing to be as intuitive as possible, clearly there needs to be some functionality that provides feedback to the customer where, for example, a particular application might have been used for the first time. It might be consuming a lot of bandwidth or a lot of network resource, but there's no mechanism there for the person to intuitively know that functionality has been taken advantage of, and you might want to implement a policy. So obviously the tool needs to be able to provide that feedback and provide that information back to customers as well. A lot of the other points, I suppose, I've mentioned previously, with the exception perhaps of the analytics and the reporting, we've implemented the reporting in such a way as to ensure that it's universally flexible with respect to the type of reports, and you can report on any aspect of the data that's being collected from Apnos. But importantly, we have effectively some canned templates, I suppose, or boilerplate templates that we believe deliver most of the specific functionality that users might want to see. And then additional reports, additional templates can be created quite easily, either by the service provider or by somebody from Iricent, for example, as well, to allow customers to get some different profile information on the basis of network activity or otherwise. Now, while we've designed Apnos for the enterprise, it's our full intention that this will be delivered by service providers, and we think there's a number of specific benefits in taking this approach, not least of which is the fact that we believe it's a specific opportunity for service providers to take advantage of the type of functionality and the type of technology that we're talking about, and to offer that as an upsell. Typically to broadband connectivity offerings, so where you've got perhaps something that's quite commodity today in the context of customers taking advantage of connectivity offerings from service providers. Apnos delivers an opportunity for that service provider to enhance the offering, either to defend existing revenues, through adding a layer of stickiness, I suppose, in the context of the customer relationship that they've got, but also to grow new revenue streams as well by delivering enhanced functionality and differentiating, I suppose, on that basis. And for that reason, we developed Apnos as a multi-tenant platform. So the service provider, we've got a number of deployment models around that. So the service provider can deploy themselves and then offer onwards to a large number of enterprise customers. We also have the capability to deploy on behalf of the service provider or multiple service providers and allow them to take advantage of that as well. It isn't, as I said previously, it's not SDN-driven agility and efficiency for its own sake, but really what we're looking at here is the ability to monetize some of this functionality, to monetize some of the technology that exists as well. We offer it as a service, and obviously it's intended to drive a revenue stream for our service providers and indeed take out costs as well. So complementing both that bottom-up and the top-down approach that I mentioned previously as well. So just to talk a little bit about the user interface for a second or two. Unfortunately, the forum today isn't conducive really to a full-blown demonstration. But what we will do is I'll talk a little bit about some possibilities in that respect as we get towards the end of the presentation. But just to give a brief insight, I suppose, with respect to some of the capabilities as well. So, looking at some of the functionality, the multi-tenant platform and the ability to add new users. And you can see from some of the screenshots that it's quite a straightforward exercise. If you want to add a new enterprise user, you simply hit the plus button, input some details around the type of enterprise that you want, and effectively you've got a new customer up and running at that point in time. There are some additional steps in terms of adding information on the network infrastructure, the switches, for example, that customer has in place as well, but they're very, very straightforward. From the user's point of view, or from the enterprise's point of view, the ability to add new rules, and again, bear in mind that we're talking about, a target audience that isn't necessarily technical in nature. So you can see it's effectively presented as a pop-up menu with a set of questions, and when you answer those questions and hit select, that rule is then implemented. If you don't like it or if it's not what you want, you can simply delete it and start again, or you can edit that rule at any stage as you move through the various different rule implementation capabilities that the platform has. And then finally, just to give a sort of just a brief indication of some of the reporting and analytics capabilities. So, as I say, we've got a number of boilerplate or canned reports that we offer, but also we have the functionality is there for the service provider to develop specific reports or to edit any of the existing reports as well. So there's a whole range of different report types that can be put in place in order to provide feedback and provide obviously a more up-to-date information in terms of network activity and network behavior for end customers as well. So at this point, I'll hand over to Rory, who's here with me, and Rory's going to talk a little bit about the architecture and some of the open daylight aspects and some of the integration. Yeah. So Rory, over to yourself.
Thanks very much, Damien. Okay, so I'm going to take a slightly more technical section in the next 2 or 3 slides. And what I'll do initially is take you on a little tour of the system so you can maybe better appreciate or understand how it works and how it brings its benefits. I'll then lead on to some technical highlights and how they translate to actual product benefits for the customers and for the service providers. And then finally, since we are a system that integrates with Open Daylight specifically for anyone who on the call who has a particular knowledge or interest in Open Daylight, I'll provide a little bit of technical information and detail on that for them. If you're not interested in or not specifically aware of Open Daylight, don't worry about that too much. Okay, so I'll go to the first slide, and here you have an overview on the left of AppNos. Basically, if it's not clear, the AppNos is everything that is in front of the cloud, and you can see that the system as a whole connects to a number of devices. I've called them open flow devices at the bottom. And you can think of these as switches or access points or gateways. In the world of Internet of Things, they could be things as well. So all of these different application models are supported and relevant. So you have perhaps on each site, you might have one of these devices, or you might actually have several devices. All of these connect to the Open Daylight or ODL SDN controller, which is the bottom box in the AppNos cloud. And then AppNos as an application sits above that to a large extent. So we have integrated some capability directly on Open Daylight, but for the most part, it actually interfaces to our application which sits outside Open Daylight. And that gives us a great deal of flexibility. It allows us to be quite agile and rapid in our expansion of features and introduction of new capabilities. And so while today we're primarily talking about AppNos as a platform for specific applications, this actually will allow us to introduce new other capabilities as well in the future. So the key component really to focus on is the box in the center of cloud, which is labeled classify, prioritize, instruct, and monitor. And these are kind of the 4 primary functions that AppNos looks after, supported by the other systems around it. So looking at this, and it might be helpful to look at the text on the right-hand side now, you'll see classify, prioritize, instruct, monitor. This is a CPIN component. And it breaks down to a classification. Essentially, each of the flows of traffic that goes to the switches are sent to the SDN controller, and the CPIN module in Apnos will attempt to classify the flow. That is, to work out what application does this flow belong to. And it may also try to correlate that with a particular user ID. Once it has that information, then it can look and see, is there a stored policy? In other words, has the person who operates Apnos, have they defined a policy for this particular application? For example, is it Netflix, in which case you might want to bar it or restrict access to it only outside business hours? Is the application Skype, in which case you want to give it a very high priority so that network traffic will be given first to this flow at the expense potentially of other maybe less important flows. There may be a user ID aspect. Perhaps it's someone accessing Facebook, but because the user ID indicates they're working for the marketing department, then we want to treat them differently compared to everyone else. We want them to be prioritized. So all of these different options are possible, and it all boils down to effectively assigning a priority to the flow, which is the second step in the list we're going through here. And once we have identified a priority, then we need to instruct the Open Daylight controller to push rules to the devices, because we're going to actually let the devices do most of the work. We're going to tell the devices how to treat the flow based on the intelligence that Apnos has in the cloud, and then allow the devices to basically manage that flow from that point onwards. While all of this is happening, so those are the three key stages, if you like. While all of this is happening, Apnos independently monitors the network activity, collects statistics from all of the devices, and uses this information, basically transmits it to a database from which we can generate reports and we can generate analytics. So you can see how your system is performing. It also helps in terms of discovery or learning capabilities. So for example, by accumulating a database of sites or applications, you can start looking at where you might need to fine-tune your prioritization. Maybe there's a particular site that you didn't realize a lot of people are accessing, and you think, okay, well that's grand, maybe there's a good reason for that or a need for that. And so it gives you a lot of, it gives you ability really to understand how you manage your traffic as a non-technical user. So that is the core of Apnos, but it's supported by a number of independent modules, and we build Apnos on a microservices architecture. And as I'll cover in the next slide, that brings a number of technical benefits for this particular application. So one unit is the application identifier module, and this is a standalone component whose job it is to identify applications, particularly in the case where we're going to examine the details of the package. So effectively, this is a deep packet inspection capability, and it gives us, it greatly extends the range of applications we can identify, including in situations where we're dealing with secure traffic. Furthermore, we also have an independent module for doing user identification, and this is implemented in a very kind of open, generalized way. So it allows us to do user identification in a variety of different manners. Apnos itself doesn't have any specific user identification capability. Instead, we integrate with application capabilities or with directory capabilities, or any of a variety of other mechanisms. For example, if there's an alignment between MAC address and a user, we could use that as well. So it's designed in a way to integrate into a variety of different third-party supported mechanisms according to what the enterprise needs. And in this context, we're probably talking more about a medium-sized customer rather than a small customer, but it is a useful capability that you can introduce at the right point in time. Supported by all of that, then, as I mentioned earlier, we have the reporting and analytics module. And the key thing about this is this accesses a database of statistics that we accumulate while Apnos is running. And we've implemented it using a templating mechanism, which really means that we can draw on that database information in very flexible ways and aggregate and combine that information. And so particularly as a service provider, you can create a set of reports for your customers, which really makes use of any of the data that we collect and combines it in any way you want. And you can offer that then to your customers in a way whereby they can build their own reports out of those templates. So with this two-stage process, we really give you a lot of flexibility in terms of creating templates in the first case, and then make it really easy for the end user to create the actual reports they want, because they start with a template. They don't have to create a report from scratch. Okay, and finally, as Damien has already mentioned, all of this is accessed by the end user through a friendly web user interface, so it's accessible anywhere. We've really concentrated on trying keeping it simple, keeping it non-technical, so that as an end user, it's very easy to set up policies and to configure it and to assign, the different parameters and characteristics that you want in a non-technical way. So I'll now go through a number of the more specific technical highlights and just go through them one by one. So first of all, what Atmos does using this entire system is provide on-demand prioritization of business-critical users, devices, applications, and in the world of Internet of Things. So it allows you to dedicate capacity within your network to the applications and services that really need it. But it also ensures that if you don't actually need it for high priority applications, that if people need to use it for other things, that they can. So it's not a black and white thing where you simply say, well, we're going to cut that out and we're going to allow that to run. You simply make use of bandwidth when you need it. So that's more dynamic. And these policies that you can create them on the fly, so you can log in and you can go in and you can create a policy for something that's going to happen in 5 minutes. And you can then remove that policy at the end of the day, and that policy will no longer be there. We provide a number of different mechanisms for defining policies. You can do it based on web addresses. You can do it based on identifying applications. In a more technical way, you can do it on a port base, although I expect in a lot of cases that won't be particularly useful. And also, as I mentioned before, you can bring a user aspect to it. So if you can identify users based on flows, then the user can be a consideration in whether a policy gets applied one way or another. To introduce a lot of flexibility into Atmos in terms of how it evolves with an organization as an organization grows, and also as Atmos as a service grows with a service provider, we have adopted a modular design with well-defined APIs to classification and instruction mechanisms. So all of the modules around are implemented in a way that we can scale up independently each of the components. And this gives us a distributed architecture and allows really the performance critical components to grow while not taking, while allowing you to grow in the various different dimensions that you need, rather than having a monolithic application that has to grow in only one direction. Atmos collects a record of all of our traffic flows, and right now it looks at applications, users, devices, sites visited, time, and duration. It is very easy to add additional parameters, and that is something that we will do as Atmos evolves. And as I said before, all of this activity and usage data that we collect is instantly available for presentation. So in terms of creating report templates, it's all of that data is available to the template. So there's no extra development or design required to make it available. On this slide, I will focus on Open Daylight specifically. Again, if Open Daylight is not of interest or something you're not involved with, don't worry about this. But I just wanted to kind of illustrate how Atmos integrates with Open Daylight from the point of view of a pretty typical Open Daylight application. So there's nothing particularly unusual about what we're doing. So Atmos is a software-defined networking application. It interfaces at the data plane with OpenFlow-enabled devices. So OpenFlow is the primary protocol that we use to interface with devices. And then within Open Daylight itself, we use the OpenFlow plugin, and that's the integration point for Atmos as an application. We interface with the MD-SAL, or Model-Driven Service Abstraction Layer, 2 points. And you can consult the diagram there. You can see we integrate with the REST-conf API, and we use that to read-write flow tables. So that will effectively instruct the switch how it needs to handle certain traffic flows that it has already presented to us for classification. And also as an MD-SAL application, it registers as a packet processing listener, and it implements the 2 handlers that are mentioned there. which are used basically to forward data to Apnos for further processing for the classification, prioritization, and instruction phases of the project. Okay, so I hope that's been interesting. That's really the architecture of Apnos in a very quick nutshell, if you like. So I'll pass back to Damien to cover the last part.
Okay, thanks, Rory. So just, I suppose, before we wrap up, I just wanted to, as I mentioned, talk a little bit about some of the plans that we have in place, some of the areas that we'll be focused on as well. Any feedback that anybody has, either in respect of this or other areas, would obviously be very interesting to us as well. There's quite a lot of different diverse areas. There's a lot of development activity, obviously, and a lot of movement going on with respect to the various different I suppose, aspects of SDN and NFE, and we're keeping tabs on a lot of that stuff, and obviously then selecting those that are slightly more related to Apnos specifically. So in that context, just to highlight a number of areas that we're focused on, I suppose. First of all, there's the opportunity or the ability for us to deploy Apnos as a VNF. Within an orchestrated NFE environment, I suppose, and possibly as part of a virtual CPE service. We offer a management and orchestration as a service platform as another component part of our go-to-market strategy within Iricent as well. So clearly it's interesting to us in that respect, where our own orchestration platform could be used as a vehicle for Apnos deployments. But clearly once we've done it, from our perspective, it makes an awful lot of sense for us to look at additional or third-party management and orchestration platforms as well and take advantage of that. And in doing so, obviously, will be our full intention to leverage some of the Intel technologies and platforms, specifically things like DPDK or SRIOV, in the context of things like fast packet processing and various other functionality, obviously, that will be important in that space as well. The integration with Open Daylight is important, and it is our full intention to broaden that integration to include additional both north and southbound interfaces as we progress, obviously, over the course of the next 12 months or so. We also plan to expand the application on thing or application on device identification capabilities, and I suppose specifically that's a constantly moving target in many respects. Technology for identification is changing all of the time, so it's important, obviously, in that respect, that for Apnos to remain up to date, we need to make sure that it's properly integrated with the various different technologies that are emerging in that respect as well. I mentioned previously in terms of things like analytics that it was important, and a learning capability for Apnos to be able to prompt policy implementations, to recognize traffic that perhaps doesn't have policies associated with it today, and prompt the user or administrator on behalf of a specific enterprise, for example, to take advantage of that information and implement a policy should that be required or should that be necessary. Obviously, that's important to us as well, and we will be expanding some of the capability around that. And then I suppose generally just looking at some of the use cases in terms of the more emergent use cases. If we consider the Internet of Things, clearly there's a whole bunch of different use cases and a whole bunch of different potential areas that we could focus on there. Some around smart city, for example, but even in the context of 5G as it relates to things like IoT as well. That's obviously very interesting and something that we're doing some research on in the background at the moment. And I suppose in that same vein, there's lots of industry-specific requirements and industry-specific functionality or capability that perhaps we might look at. The ones that spring to mind immediately are things like security, healthcare, for example. But there's a whole bunch of others that share similar general characteristics, I suppose, or similar general requirements. So we are looking at that right now. And then obviously it's a technology-driven industry. It's a technology-led area, and we're continuously monitoring any new emerging technologies or technologies that are becoming more widely adopted. And specifically in that context, we've referenced vector packet processing and P4, for example, here, but there's a bunch of others that are important and that may emerge as being relevant in the context of Apnos or Apnos implementations as we move onwards as well. We just wanted to give an insight or a little bit of a view, I suppose, a window into some of the things that we're thinking of, and hopefully, obviously, as time emerges, this list will become both broader and longer, and there'll be a lot more definition around some of the functionality and some of the capability there as well. So really, I suppose at this point in time, I just want to wrap up. Maybe we've got a bunch of questions that we'll run through now in a second. But just to summarise, I suppose, in the context of AppNos, and we've mentioned all of this already, it's a cloud-hosted platform offering access control, security, and traffic optimization. We deliver that through service providers for enterprise customers. It allows enterprise customers to prioritize and control network traffic either by application, by device, by user, by time of day, or by any combination of the above. It leverages key SDN features in terms of providing that and doing that implementation. And obviously, we want to make sure that in that context, that we continue obviously and facilitate that adoption of SDN and indeed NFV related technologies as well. And importantly, a really, really key component part is the analytics and the reporting part of AppNos, the capability that analytics and reporting brings, both in the context of understanding what functionality is being taken advantage of, how effective that is, and what additional network activity is in place or is taking place that perhaps needs a policy associated with it, or at least that the end user should be aware of in that respect as well. So to wrap up, I just want to say, before we get to questions, I just want to say thanks a million to everybody for joining the webinar today. If you want more information, you can certainly feel free to either contact us directly. I've shared my own email address there. You can certainly visit the website. We've got a contact us section on the website, so it's certainly it's possible to get in touch that way. I suppose maybe importantly, in the context of perhaps if anybody would like to see a little bit more detail, we can certainly organise specific demonstrations for interested potential customers or partners. But we will be at Mobile World Congress. We'll be in Hall 7 from the 27th of February to the 2nd of March. So if anybody would like to come along and have a little bit more detailed look and get introduced or just have a chat perhaps about some of the functionality, then certainly feel free to contact us either in advance or just pop along at the time as well and say hi. So that's pretty much it. We'll turn over to some questions. At this point in time, I think we've got 6 or 7. So I don't think, do we have any order, Rory, that we want to take here?
No, just
let me just pick them out. So one here is AppNos product or vendor specific. The short answer to that is no. On the understanding that by product or vendor specific, we mean in terms of the actual switch manufacturer or access point manufacturer, for example, then no. We were very specific in terms of the development of AppNos, that we wanted to make sure that it wasn't specific in that context to individual vendor implementations on that basis. So no, it's very much a third-party application that sits on top of. And we've ways, by the way, of integrating both in greenfield, obviously, and also in brownfield environments as well around that. Maybe a question for you, Rory. Is there an issue with the amount of traffic to and from the user site to AppNos via Open Daylight?
Well, no, and that might become very clear when, based on the technical walkthrough we had. The way AppNos works is we do get some of the traffic from the switch, but we apply basically evaluate it, and we apply classification, identification, and then we push rules to the switch. So from that point onwards, we really delegate to the switch or the thing or access points or whatever it is we're managing, and it then does all the work. So primarily AppNos is about control plane interchanges with the network, and that's the way we kind of manage the volume of traffic between the cloud and our devices.
Okay. Another question is which version of OpenFlow is supported?
So we have massive dependencies on different versions of OpenFlow, but normally right now we work 1.3.
And we see 1.3 as being the universally deployed version anyway, yeah. So in that context it makes a lot of sense as well, yeah. And then maybe just 1 or 2 more. what effort is required to create a new user customized report? Rory, do you want to?
Yeah, so as I described earlier, it really comes down to two different levels. If you're an end user, you'll be offered a number of report templates, which you can then use to create your own reports, which you can personalize or customize. So you can choose, for example, what the time or date range of a particular report type is. If it's a report that, for example, you want to see the most visited sites, you can choose how many of those. So do you want to see maybe the top 5 or the top 20? So there are a number of parameters associated with each report template. And as an end user, then you just select from a small number of parameters how you want to personalize it or customize it for your specific need. So on that level, it's extremely easy to use, and it's purposefully kept simple. Then in terms of creating new templates, this is very, very flexible. It's also quite powerful. So today we reserve that capability for service providers, and really that gives them full access to the full range of data and to aggregate and combine it. And for that, then there's a richer interface which requires a slightly more technical mindset. But it gives you the power to create templates for your customers, and presumably, as customers, as they get to know their customers better, they'll know the type of templates they need to create.
Okay, so I think we still have a couple of minutes, so we'll just keep going. There's a couple more questions here. There's one specifically related to the mention of OSM and asking for some thoughts on OpenO and OpenStack Tacker. I guess that really probably more relevant to the NFE focus, the orchestration side of what we do. But if you want to contact me directly, I'm more than happy to have that conversation in the context of NFE orchestration. There's a couple of questions around the extent to which Apnos is bound to Open Daylight or OpenFlow, any plans for non-OpenFlow versions, and could it be adapted to work with other SDN controllers? So maybe just to take that as a single kind of question. Hopefully we've answered some of those questions as we went through the slides anyway, but I think the short answer is that it isn't tightly bound to either or any of those platforms. We're happy enough to look at other implementations. We chose what we believed was the most obvious starting point, both in the context of Open Daylight, which is a very significant market share advantage over some of the other controllers that are out there. And from an OpenFlow perspective, obviously it's certainly one of the ways to integrate, but there's lots of others that we can and are exploring right now in the context of particular implementations as well. I don't know, Rory, do you want to expand on any of that?
Yeah, sure. I think the key point to observe there, and I think it should be clear from the diagram, is that we have a clean separation between the vast majority of Apnos and the SDN controller, and then we have a component within the SDN controller, which is also ours, and we have a well-defined API between those two. So in fact, the amount of work to introduce support for another SDN controller would really be confined to that component. The vast majority of Apnos wouldn't change and isn't specific to Open Daylight at all.
Okay, so that wraps up the questions, and I think wraps up the session for today. As I said, if anybody would like either more details or wants to follow up in any way, just pop the contact details back up again. Feel free to get in touch either directly or to drop by if you happen to be attending Mobile World Congress later in February as well. But all that remains for me is to say thank you to everybody for joining today. Hopefully you found the session interesting, and we certainly look forward to being in touch in the future. Thank you.
Thank you from me too.